It's elementary to know that black metal is no stranger to controversy. And because of that controversy, you'll come across quite a handful of individuals who are quite detested among the black metal scene and its peers. So much so, with all of these individuals, that if I were to do a video on each one that has done something heinous of a series, it would probably go on for a year over and then some. Which, in that statement, it's quite bold to assume who is the absolute most hated. However, if we were to discuss who is one of the most hated in terms of at least business practices, easily the first name that would come up would be Blake Judd. For those who are unaware, Blake Judd is a multi-instrumentalist and the mastermind behind the black metal band Knockmystium. Formed in the year 2000, based out of Illinois, Knockmystium was one of the many black metal bands coming forth from the United States during the early 2000s, along with such noticeable names as Leviathan, Xaster, and Krieg. From the band's earliest beginnings from the year 2000 up to 2004, Knockmystium would release a handful of demos along with two full-length albums, that being Reign of the Malicious and Demise, which plays black metal in a very lo-fi, stripped-down, raw approach that in terms of its qualities and characteristics takes a lot of inspiration from Judas Iscariot. Judas Iscariot being one of the earliest black metal bands to form in the United States and a big pioneer when it comes to anything that has to do with USBM, aka United States Black Metal. All the while, Blake Judd would get even more integrated with the United States black metal scene, as in 2005 he would do a split with Xaster. He would also become a bass player for Krieg for a handful of years, and even started what is considered by many as a black metal supergroup, as in 2004 he formed with other individuals the band Twilight, and in 2005 they released their debut full-length self-titled album. Going a little bit off topic here, but it's worth to mention with Twilight, if you look at the band's history with the lineup, it's quite interesting, as it would have members from Leviathan, that being Jeff Whitehead, along with members from Krieg. Even Aaron Turner from ISIS was a part of Twilight for a handful of years, and believe it or not, even Thurston Moore from Sonic Youth played guitar and did vocals for Twilight. So overall it's quite interesting and quite the change up for a supergroup when it comes to black metal. Fast forward an additional year to 2006, and Knockmystium would release their third full-length album, Instinct Decay. Comparably, this album is somewhat similar to that of the previous two in terms of atmosphere and overall tone, as it still carries a strong essence of black metal with its raw and razor-sharp guitar leads. However, the contrast with this particular album is you'll notice down there's quite a bit of experimentation in forms of psychedelia, heavily influenced when it comes to the pacing and overall textures and tones of it. Before I go any further, regardless of what you think of Blake Judd and his practices, at least until we get later on into this video, for its time being released in 2006, this album was quite the unconventional approach to black metal. Because even for today's standards, coming across something that is psychedelic black metal is a rare occurrence, and this came out in 2006. As anything else you'll come across similar to this would be bands forming at least 5 to 10 years after. Noteworthy names would be Aranzi Pazuzu, Hail Spirit Noir, A Forest of Stars kind of does it from time to time. And if you really want to get nitpicky with it, some releases from the Black Twilight Circle such as Arizmenda and Volan kind of fit this category. So again, for 2006 standards, this was something very unconventional. Because of the songwriting being so different from the norm, it was able to get the attention for a lot of people, thus it sold pretty well. Because of its sales, Knockmystium was able to sign to Century Media in 2008, which is quite significant considering the fact that Century Media is a really big label for anything that has to do with extreme metal, comparably to everything else that he was a part of that were more underground and low budget labels. From 2008 to 2010, while signed to Century Media, Knockmystium was able to release a two-part album, that being Assassins Black Metal Part 1 in 2008 and Addicts Black Metal Part 2 in 2010. Stylistically, these two albums are a continuation of Instinct Decay, of that psychedelic yet experimental approach with black metal, as has a lot of interludes and a lot of psychedelic and trippy like passages, within the instrumentation. However, what becomes really noticeable here for a lot of people when it comes to the timeline of understanding Blake Judd is you start noticing now lyrically and musically there's a lot to do with drugs and psychedelics. One of those drugs being heroin. It's hard to pinpoint the exact year when Blake Judd started using heroin, but from what we know, at least with his work with Knockmistium, at least when it comes to the strong change-up around 2006 with Instinct Decay, a lot of people speculate that at least around the mid-2000s to the late 2000s when this double album was being released is when Blake Judd started becoming addicted to this substance. Not like you guys need to hear it from me, but the abuse of heroin has some long-term severe side effects, as any individual will become dependent on getting their fix, Blake being no different. And as we continue the story on to the 2010s, this is where we get to the point in the story now where there is just a laundry list to go through of all different scams and schemes that Blake did in order to get any sort of money to get his fix. Out of all the accounts I came across, the most in-depth article would come from Vice when they interviewed Neil Jameson, the vocalist for the black metal band Krieg. It's an extremely detailed and in-depth article that took me roughly around 15 to 20 minutes to read in full. So I'm not going to go paragraph by paragraph here, but if you want to read it all together, I'll have it linked down below in the description. As I stated, it's really detailed and interesting stuff to know all about this stuff that goes on behind the scenes. But just know that Neil Jameson has known Blake Judd for 15 years at this point when it was conducted the interview in 2014, and talks about all of his work that he did with Blake Judd, especially when it came to their music that they did with Knockmistium, Krieg, and Twilight, and even discusses their own personal lives as they showcase some personal photos, to even Neil Jameson attending Blake Judd's wedding. So even though it's a very lengthy read, a huge portion of this article is brought up numerous times where Blake Judd tries to get money from Neil Jameson in any way, shape, or form. Whether it be asking for money, borrowing money and never paying Neil back, to re-releasing Krieg albums, again, Neil Jameson's band, behind his back and not giving him any royalties and cashing in on these re-releases. Other events that are brought up in this article is when Blake Judd tried to do a performance with Knockmistium and have Neil Jameson perform with him, whether it be playing bass or other instruments, and not being compensated for it, whether it be his traveling expenses to his overall time performing with him. Really didn't see a dime from it. But I would say the most vivid and worst parts of this article to read is when Neil Jameson ever brings up any of the drug abuse that happened with Blake Judd. As he stated, he would stay over his apartment when it came to recording albums in Chicago, and that the apartment was always in a mess, that whenever he went to the bathroom to brush his teeth, there was used needles all over the sink, to whenever he tried to bathe, there were blood stains in the bathtub, and he would frequently see drug dealers coming and going throughout the apartment whenever Blake Judd needed to get his fix. And the last tidbit from this article I want to include, and it's easily the most messed up here, would be, according to Neil Jameson, is that although unclear as to what started this altercation, Blake Judd and his wife at the time got into a fight. Thus, Blake Judd would assault his own wife, apparently throwing her and breaking her legs, putting her in the hospital, and Blake would end up calling Neil Jameson asking for money as they only took cash, crying on the phone, pleading to get more finances from Neil Jameson. And it's just a really sick and twisted individual to even start that altercation, but even have the nerve to start asking for money. Once again, let me remind you that these are just the portions within the article that really stood out to me here, and this is all coming from one individual with their experiences with Blake, as this is just the tip of the iceberg. Between the years of 2012 and 2013, back when the Knockmistium Facebook page was still up and Blake was in control of it, he would post records for sale during some times, and most of those records were quite rare, limited first presses that he would charge upwards to $300. Not sure if you can tell, but obviously there's quite the market for physical media being bought in extreme metal, as people love to collect it. So obviously people would send Blake these, payment orders of like 50 to 300 bucks and up for these records. The only problem being, they never got their records, but Blake got his money. What might you ask he's using that money for? Heroin, of course. Thankfully, since we live in the age of the internet, and all of PayPal's transactions can be refundable and traced back, a lot of people took wind to what Blake Judd was doing. Thus, he got quite the notorious reputation among his own fan base, as people took to internet forums such as the Nuclear War Now forums, which aren't up anymore, discussing the strong distaste they had for the customer service or lack thereof from Blake's work. However, what really publicized Blake in a very negative light with his scummish ways of selling merchandise to individuals is when he tried to do a deal with Yosuke Konishi, the owner to that of Nuclear War Now. So as the story goes, Blake tried selling dead stock, that being unsold merchandise from his now defunct label at that time, Battle Command Records, to Nuclear War Now, that being roughly around 500 CDs and 2 test presses from an Archcode album. Yet, when Yosuke caught word from Hell's Headbangers that Blake did the same thing to them, trying to sell dead stock to Hell's Headbangers, and they never received the inventory, this is where Yosuke put Blake Judd on full blast. As later that year in 2013, both Nuclear War Now and Hell's Headbangers put out this shirt called the Blake Crush shirt, which is an obvious parody to Mayhem's Death Crush with the Death-like Silence logo and font for it. The print for that shirt has Battle Command Silence with a mugshot of Blake, which I'll discuss in a little bit here, and around him says, "No reply, no package, no shame, no refund." Speaking about that mugshot, in the same year in 2013, on October 11th, Blake Judd was arrested for a misdemeanor on theft charges not exceeding $500, as he ended up spending a month in jail, all for the fact that he stole his roommate's guitar to sell for heroin. With everything seemingly spiraling out of control for Knockmistium, it was heavily considered that they disbanded in 2013, only for them to start it right back up a year later in 2014. During that same year, Knockmistium would release their album The World We Left Behind, which at this point they were still signed to Century Media, and the album was received quite positively among the fans. However, the controversy and scummy behavior was only just starting. You see, in a 2013 interview, Blake takes full responsibility and apologizes for all the people that he screwed over with, ever it be ordering records to sending out merchandise, only for a year later in 2014 to basically do the same thing all over again. As whenever fans ordered the album The World We Left Behind exactly from Blake, he would never fulfill the orders, he would never send them out. And thus this is where Century Media took full control and repaid back all the fans and even cut ties with Knockmistium. During the years of 2015 and 2016, being out a job and not having a label signed to, Blake would end up living in a homeless shelter and even going to drug rehabilitation therapy multiple times. Only for a year later in 2017, where he would start Knockmistium up once again, but this time do it on his own record label, that being Ascension Monuments Media. You would think, after everything that's happened, from fans calling you out for being ripped off, labels calling you out, to even making merchandise, putting you on full blast, to articles being published about you, to going to rehab and living out of a homeless shelter, you'd think you would learn from your past mistakes. That's not the case here. Since Blake Judd owns his own record label at this point, I guess he assumed he can press whatever record he wants, whenever he wants, because it would only be a year later in 2018 where he would start doing represses for the Judas Iscariot discography, such as vinyl represses, which if you know anything about Judas Iscariot and the man behind it, that being Andrew Harris, he never planned to have represses for it and considered it to be quite sacred to him, having these one and only time presses. But when he found out about the represses from Ascension Monuments Media, he considered them as unauthorized, disgraceful bootlegs. An example I can give you between the differences of a legit copy and a bootleg is I'm fortunate enough that I have at least one vinyl copy of Judas Iscariot, that of Great Eternity, which if you notice just from the album artwork, the color palette is quite different. But the biggest thing to note here is on the backside when it comes to the label information, as long as it says on the bottom anything but Ascension Monuments Media, it'll be a legit pressing. But at the very least, you would think after everything that's happened, alright, they're bootlegs, but he sent them out to the customers, right? Nope. Once again, the cycle repeats. I remember seeing so many people discussing just all their distaste for what was going on. People were mass flagging his PayPal account, trying to file reports left and right, that either you would file a report and you would actually get your package in the mail weeks later, or at the very least, you would get a refund. Regardless, Blake Judd was back to his scummy behavior again. It's also worth mentioning that during this time when Ascension Monuments Media was releasing all of these bootlegs as we know it today, one of them happened to be some of the works by Leviathan. When Jeff Whitehead, the mastermind behind Leviathan, found out that all of his work was being released under this label and he wasn't being compensated for any royalties, he immediately cut ties with it. Now, maybe I'm force connecting some dots here, but in the same year in 2018, Leviathan would repress the album Tentacles of Horror. And on the back side of it, it states this: Moribund Records, all rights reserved, all propaganda published by Moribund Cult Music. Unauthorized reproduction is a violation of applicable law. Offenders will be ruthlessly terminated. I swear, that just seems like such a call out to Blake. With all this going on, one might think, did Blake relapse? Is he doing all of this again, scamming people to get money so he can get his fix with heroin? Well, apparently in 2020 on the Knock Mystium Facebook, which even though it's taken down, thankfully was archived, he states that he's been going to rehabilitation and that he's been clean for 5 years at that point. The problem is, with his track record of being really inconsistent, being honest with the fans when it came to either selling merchandise or, holding up his end of the bargain with all of the musicians he worked with, like, how much can we really believe this post? So, once again, Knock Mystium would disband in the year 2020. And you would think at this point, this is where the story ends. Not really. As recent as 2024, Knock Mystium has started up again for like the 4th or 5th time. And what makes this really odd is now with all the controversy being such luggage for Knock Mystium, they're kind of like playing off of it a little bit in like one of the weirdest marketing promos I've ever seen. As in that same year of 2024, Knock Mystium would get signed to Prophecy Productions somehow, and by doing so, they released a promo of the upcoming album, but the promo is just basically Knock Mystium kind of playing with all of their controversy, all the news articles and all the fans talking about how much of a scumbag, how of a scammer Blake Judd is, that they're just consistently showcasing that on the promo video. It's one of the weirdest things I've ever seen to hype up a new album. Other recent events is Blake Judd going on interviews discussing how he's dealing with all the backlash and how he wants to continue on with Knock Mystium to look at the future, but I just don't see that winning over any people. After all the years of scamming people out of their money, using it for drugs, scamming over labels, scamming over bands and artists, I don't think people are really so ready to forgive him at any point, anytime soon. And just from my own, I guess, predictions here, I can already tell that either he's going to relapse again or he's going to discontinue Knock Mystium probably by next year. For my closing remarks in this video, I just want to state that I tried my absolute best to be as informative as possible. I know that there's quite a strong bias on my behalf with a video title like this, but from all of the articles and interviews you could come across all discussing Blake Judd, all of it is negative, especially since some of the acts that he did are quite heinous and unforgivable considering some that I brought up. But do I want anything malevolent to happen to him? No. What I hope happens is he finds some real true help, because whatever he's doing is not working, as he consistently seems to relapse over and over again. In the article I brought up done by Vice all about Neil Jamison's experiences with Blake Judd is that at the very end of it he states that he doesn't want anything malevolent to happen to Blake. What he really thinks will work, or at least he hopes happens, is he burns out and crashes so hard that maybe he ends up in a really, tightly secure rehabilitation center in some kind of a way, and or he goes to prison and hangs dry out enough that he really starts to be almost forced in a way mentally to realize his mistakes, that there is no going back. Again, I think out of everyone, that Neil Jamison kind of got the worst of it with his experiences, if he's able to recollect all of it like day by day basically. But for what it's worth, I don't really know how Blake is going to continue on with all this baggage, and I don't really see a future for Knockmystium or any other of his works really anytime soon. And that'll do it for this video, guys. Like always, links provided to what was playing in the background along with some of the articles I brought up will be in the description below. Really curious to know what you think of Knockmystium and Blake Judd, and that is that. So like always, guys, make sure you guys drink plenty of water to stay hydrated, and have a great day.